Hello. I'd like to take a moment to read a speech to you. I'll just call this speech for now the Rally Before the Darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of America, a year of world historical events is coming to an end. A year of great decisions is approaching. In this grave period, I speak to you, patriots, as the representatives of the United States of America. In addition, the entire American nation should also review what has happened and take note of the decisions required by the present and the future. After the repeated rejection of my peace proposal by the Israeli Prime Minister and the clique that supports and controls him, it was clear by the spring of this year that this war would have to be fought through to the end, contrary to all logic and necessity. You, my friends and patriots, know that I have always detested half-hearted or weak decisions. If God has deemed that the American people are not to be spared in this struggle, then I am thankful that He has entrusted me with the leadership in a historic conflict that will be decisive in determining the future, not only of our American history, but also of the history of Europe and even the entire world. The American people and its soldiers work and fight today not only for themselves and their own age, but also for many generations to come. A historical task of unique dimensions has been entrusted to us by the Creator that we are now obliged to carry out. What is America, my patriots? There is no geographical definition of our continent, but only an ethnic, national, and cultural one. The frontier of this continent is not the Rio Grande or the Rocky Mountains, but rather the line that divides the American outlook on life from that of the communists. I have to make these remarks because this struggle, which became obviously unavoidable in the early months of this year, and which the United States above all is now called upon to lead, this struggle also greatly transcends the interests of our own people and nation. When the Greeks once stood against the Persians, they defended more than just Greece. When the Romans stood against the Carthaginians, they defended more than just Rome. When the Roman and Germanic peoples stood together against the Huns, they defended more than just the West. When German emperors stood against the Mongols, they defended more than just Germany. And when Spanish heroes stood against Africa, they defended not just Spain, but all of Europe as well. In the same way, America does not fight today just for itself, but for our entire world. I have not sought war. To the contrary, I have done everything to avoid conflict. But I would forget my duty and my conscience if I were to do nothing in spite of the realization that a conflict had become unavoidable. Because I regarded Israel as the gravest danger, not only for the United States, but for all of Europe, I decided, if possible, to give the order myself to attack a few days before the outbreak of this conflict. A truly impressive amount of authentic material is now available which confirms that an Israeli attack was intended. We are also sure about when this attack was to take place. In view of this danger, the extent of which we are perhaps only now truly aware, I can only thank the Lord God that He enlightened me in time and has given me the strength to do what must be done. Millions of Gazans may thank Him for their lives and all of Europe for its existence. If the United States with its soldiers and weapons had not stood against this opponent, a storm would have burned over Palestine that would have eliminated, once and for all time, and in all its intellectual paucity and traditional stupidity, the laughable idea of Middle Eastern balance of power. These are sober facts, but may they never be forgotten by history or vanish from the memory of our own American nation. For behind these facts are the achievements, sacrifices, and sufferings, the heroism and readiness to die of millions of the best men of our own people and the countries allied with us. Everything had to be fought for at the cost of health and life, and through struggles such as those back in the States can hardly imagine. Our adversaries today are the same familiar enemies of more than 100 years. But the path before us cannot be compared to the road we have already taken. Today, the American people fully realize that this is a decisive hour of our existence. Millions of patriots are faithfully doing their duty under the most difficult conditions. Millions of American farmers and workers and women and girls are in factories and offices, in the fields and farmlands, working hard to sustain our people and lend aid to the battle before us. Allied with us are strong nations that have suffered the same misery and faced the same enemies. The World Economic Forum and its banking elite have called us the 98%. That is correct, but the 98% want to live, and they will certainly make sure that what little they have to live on is not stolen from them by the 2%. You, my patriot friends, know of my relentless determination to carry through to a successful conclusion any struggle that has already commenced. You know of my determination in such a struggle to do everything necessary to break all resistance that must be broken. In my first speech of this war, I pledged that neither force of arms nor time would defeat America. I want to assure my opponents that while neither force of arms nor time will defeat us, in addition, no internal uncertainty will weaken us in the fulfillment of our patriotic duty. When we think of the sacrifice and effort of our soldiers, and when we consider the number of all those in past generations who gave their lives for the survival and greatness of the American nation, then we are really conscious of the magnitude of the duty that is ours now. But whoever tries to shirk this duty has no right to be regarded as a fellow American. Just as we were pitilessly hard in our struggle for power, so also will we be just as ruthless in the struggle for the survival of our nation. During a time in which thousands of our best men, the fathers and sons of our people, have given their lives, anyone in the states who betrays the sacrifice on the front is a traitor. Regardless of the pretext with which an attempt is made to disrupt the American front, undermine the will to resist of our people, weaken the authority of the regime, or sabotage the achievements of the homeland, the guilty person will be labeled a traitor. But with this difference, the soldier at the front who makes this sacrifice will be held in the greatest honor, whereas the person who debases the sacrifice of honor will bear shame and disgrace. Our opponents should not deceive themselves. In the 250 years of recorded American history, our people have never been more determined and united than today. The Lord of the universe has been generous to us in recent months, and we now bow in gratitude before him who has permitted us to be members of such a great nation. We thank him that along with those in earlier and coming generations of the United States, our deeds of honor may also be recorded in the eternal book of American history. So that speech was not a speech that I wrote, although I did modify it very slightly for this reading, for this video. This speech was given by Adolf Hitler in December of 1941 in Berlin to a large crowd of military leaders and his own people, his citizens. If you can imagine that speech being said by a man who is touted to us as a evil monster, but you heard him talking about doing the will of God and calling upon God's strength to save their nation. You heard about the patriotism that they had to muster just to stay in the fight when all these forces were coming against them. Now, it's interesting, this speech is considered in history to be the speech in which Hitler declared war on the United States. And then just a day or two later, America declared war on Germany. But it's not quite as simple as that. At the end of this speech, there's not necessarily a direct declaration of war in this speech at all. In fact, I had a hard time finding it. I had to search online. I asked AI, where is the declaration of war in this speech? I didn't get any good, solid results. And even the AI would not even quote this speech to me. So I dug myself, and the best I could find was towards the end, there's a section where Hitler talks about the documentation that was signed in Berlin that day by the, quote, three powers. And when he speaks of the three powers, he means Germany and the allies they had, Italy and Japan. So it says towards the end of this speech that the three powers have therefore concluded the following agreement, which was signed in Berlin today. In their unshakable determination not to lay down arms until the joint war against the USA and England reaches a successful conclusion, the German, Italian, and Japanese governments have agreed on the following points. 1. That they would wage the common war that was forced upon them by the United States and England, with all means of power at their disposal, to a victorious conclusion. Again, they felt that they were being forced to fight. Hitler had, prior to this, made multiple concessions, reached out multiple times both to Churchill in England and Roosevelt in the States to try to come up with peaceful negotiations to stop the fighting. And they were rejected. All of his attempts were rejected. Some of them were not even heard by either the English government or the American government. Point number 2 is that the three powers undertook not to conclude an armistice or peace with the U.S. or with England without complete mutual understanding. Number 3, that they would continue the closest cooperation even after the victorious conclusion of the war in order to bring about a just new order in the sense of their tripartite pact that was concluded by them in September of 1940. They had already come up with peace agreements and negotiations, and Germany, Italy, and Japan were entering into a pact on this day to, even after the war was complete, to then establish a peaceful order for Europe and the world. So I think you can see from this that even in just this speech, which again is very hard to really get information about online, you can find copies of it and read through it, but it is not, for instance, easily accessible on sites like Wikipedia. Most things, when you search for them, they just appear as a Wikipedia article. This is not there. So just be aware of that, and the whole idea that's out there that you will find if you search, that this was their declaration of war against the United States, which is only half true. This is Germany, Italy, and Japan actually entering into an agreement that they were already at war and that had been forced upon them by both England and the United States. In Hitler's summary of this speech, he says these things. Ever since my last peace proposal of July 1940 was rejected, we have realized that this struggle has to be fought out to its last implications. That the Anglo-Saxon Jewish capitalist world finds itself now in one and the same front with Bolshevism does not surprise us National Socialists. We have always found them in company. Hitler is saying here that the Anglo-Saxons, the Jews, the capitalists, and the Bolsheviks were working together. And he says that doesn't surprise them because they've seen that all through the past. That the Bolsheviks were in league with the Anglo-Saxons, the English, and with the Jews. He says, when 23 years ago I decided to enter political life and lift this nation out of its decline, I was a nameless, unknown soldier. Many among you know how difficult were the first few years of the struggle. From the time when Movement 1 consisted of 7 men until we took over power in January of 1933, the path was so miraculous that only Providence itself, with its blessing, could have made this possible. Today, he says, I am at the head of the strongest army in the world, the most gigantic air force, and of a proud navy. Behind and around me stands the party with which I became great and which has become great through me. The enemies I see before me are the same enemies as 20 years ago. The American president and his plutocratic clique have mocked us as the have-nots, and that is true, but the have-nots will see to it that they are not robbed of what little they have. I hope that you can understand and kind of see, when you hear this, the struggle that was laid at the feet of Hitler and the German nation. They were really boxed in. They being in the middle between the Bolsheviks and the English. They had nowhere to go, and so they had to ally themselves and then defend their nation to its dying end. And what happened after this speech, towards the end of the war? Well, that's when the English and the Americans bombed the citizens of Germany into oblivion. There was no regard whatsoever by either country for the Geneva conventions of war. They went straight for the citizens of Germany and killed them ruthlessly and without mercy, both from the air and then when they got on the ground. And then after the war, the Germans were ruthlessly raped and pillaged by the Russians and the Bolsheviks. And this went on for years. And those of the Germans that were captured by the Allies, by America and by England, many were actually taken to the Rhine River and put in concentration camps by the Allies. I bet they never taught you that in grade school. The Germans who survived the war, many of them were put in concentration camps with almost nothing to eat and no shelter. And there, many thousands of the Germans simply died from exposure because the concentration camps run by American soldiers were so violently horrible that many of them just died laying on the ground. So I hope that, this lets you see inside the mind of a man that is portrayed to the world as a criminal and an absolute monster who is vicious and ruthless and only wants to destroy and kill. But what we see in this speech, and what you see if you actually go to primary source material on the matter, you will see a man who was fighting for the life of his country, who was penned in on both sides by Jews, capitalists, bankers, and Bolsheviks, and had nowhere to go except to rally his people with a rallying cry such as the one in this speech about patriotism, God, love of country, love of fellow man, and try to prepare them for the darkness that was about to descend upon them. God help us all.